Amid the glittering chandeliers of Greystone Manor, a priceless emerald necklace vanishes during a lavish gala, plunging the guests into a web of suspicion. Was it Lady Beatrice, hiding her debts? The charming but desperate Roland Finch? The calculating jeweller, Gideon Wells? Or Clara, the nervous maid with a secret? Only Miss Jane Marple, with her sharp eyes and quiet wisdom, can unravel the clues. Lace in the garden, a whiff of lavender, a hidden truth to catch a thief before they slip away. Secrets unravel, but time is running out. Chapter 1. The Gala at Greystone Manor. The air in Greystone Manor's grand ballroom shimmered with the soft glow of a dozen chandeliers, their crystal prisms scattering light across the polished parquet floor. Laughter and the clink of champagne flutes mingled with the strains of a string quartet, playing a lively waltz that set silk gowns swirling and black ties bobbing in rhythm. Lady Beatrice Ashford, the evening's hostess, moved through the crowd with the grace of a seasoned diplomat, her smile as carefully curated as the roses in her gardens. Around her neck gleamed the Ashford emerald necklace, a cascade of deep green stones set in gold filigree, each gem catching the light like a verdant star. It was, as the village gossips often whispered, worth a small fortune, perhaps more than the manor itself, now that Sir Henry Ashford's debts had come to light after his passing. In a quiet corner, near a velvet-draped window overlooking the moonlit lawns, sat Miss Jane Marple, her knitting needles clicking softly in her lap. She wore a simple black lace dress, her only adornment a modest brooch, and her mild blue eyes surveyed the room with an air of gentle curiosity. Lady Beatrice had invited her as a distant cousin, a gesture of familial duty, but Miss Marple's presence was no accident. She had a knack for noticing what others overlooked: the fleeting glance, the tightened lip, the hand that lingered too long on a glass. To her, a gala was not merely a social affair, but a tapestry of human motives, woven with threads of ambition, envy, and secrets. The guests were a glittering assembly: landed gentry, a smattering of London society, and a few local notables. Among them was Mr. Roland Finch, a dashing young man whose charm was matched only by his rumoured gambling debts. He spun a laughing debutante across the floor, his eyes bright but restless. Nearby, Mr. Gideon Wells, the jeweller who had appraised the emerald necklace that very afternoon, stood conversing with a portly baronet, his gestures precise, and his cufflinks, small emerald studs, glinting subtly. Clara, Lady Beatrice's maid, moved silently through the crowd, her plain grey uniform a stark contrast to the opulence around her. Miss Marple noted the girl's quick, nervous steps as she cleared empty glasses, her face pale beneath a neat cap. As the clock neared midnight, the mood in the ballroom was at its peak. Lady Beatrice, radiant in her sapphire gown, raised a toast to her guests, the necklace sparkling with every word. Miss Marple, sipping her sherry, observed how the hostess's eyes darted briefly to the jeweller, then to Finch, before settling on the crowd with practised warmth. A woman who knows she is watched, Miss Marple thought, her needles pausing for a moment. Then came the scream, a sharp, wrenching cry that cut through the music like a knife. The quartet faltered, and the dancers froze. All eyes turned to Lady Beatrice, who stood at the far end of the ballroom, her hand clutching her throat where the necklace should have been. "It's gone!" she gasped, her voice trembling with a mix of horror and disbelief. "My necklace! It's been stolen!" A murmur rippled through the guests, a blend of shock and morbid excitement. Miss Marple set her knitting aside and rose, her small figure moving unnoticed toward the edge of the crowd. Lady Beatrice was ushered toward her private dressing room, where the necklace had last been seen, and a footman was dispatched to fetch Inspector Harrow from the village. As the guests whispered theories, pickpockets, jewel thieves, even a daring cat burglar, Miss Marple's mind turned to quieter possibilities. A thief in a ballroom, she mused, is rarely a stranger. Her eyes lingered on Clara, who hovered near the dressing-room door, her hands twisting in her apron, and on Finch, whose smile had vanished, replaced by a look of sharp calculation. The game, as Miss Marple knew so well, had begun. Chapter 2. The scene of the crime. The clamour of the ballroom had faded to a tense hum as the guests of Greystone Manor crowded the corridor, leading to Lady Beatrice Ashford's private dressing-room. The heavy oak door, carved with delicate acanthus leaves, stood ajar, revealing a scene of disarray that seemed almost theatrical against the manor's polished elegance. Inside, the velvet-lined case that had held the emerald necklace lay open and empty on the rosewood vanity, its crimson interior a stark accusation. The air was thick with the scent of jasmine from Lady Beatrice's perfume, mingling with the faint dampness of the night air, drifting through a slightly open window. Miss Jane Marple, unobtrusive as ever, stood just outside the threshold, her sharp eyes taking in every detail, while the other guests pressed forward, their whispers buzzing like bees in a hive. Lady Beatrice, her sapphire gown now slightly crumpled, stood trembling beside the vanity, her hands clasped tightly, as if to steady herself. Her face, usually a mask of aristocratic composure, was pale, her lips quivering with what might have been shock or something more guarded. "It was here," she said, her voice low but carrying in the hushed room. "I swear it. I left it right here when I went to greet Lord Pennington. I was gone only a moment." Her eyes darted to the empty case, then to the gathered crowd, as if seeking an ally or fearing an accuser. Inspector Harrow, a wiry man with a bristling moustache and an air of brisk efficiency, had arrived with commendable speed from the village. His notebook was already open, his pencil scratching as he surveyed the room. He was not, Miss Marple noted, a man given to flights of fancy. His questions were clipped, his manner methodical. "When did you last see the necklace, Lady Ashford?" he asked, his tone betraying no hint of the deference one might expect toward a woman of her station. "Just before 10, Lady Beatrice replied, her voice steadier now. "I took it off to adjust my hair. Those pins, you know, they can be so tiresome. I placed it in the case, locked it, and went downstairs. I couldn't have been gone more than 10 minutes. And the key." Inspector Harrow's eyes narrowed slightly. "In my reticule," she said, producing a small silk purse from the folds of her gown. She opened it with trembling fingers, revealing a tiny gold key nestled among her handkerchief and a powder compact. "I always keep it with me." Miss Marple, standing quietly by a gilt-framed mirror, observed the exchange with interest. The key was a small thing, easily overlooked, yet it ruled out a casual thief, unless, of course, the lock had been tampered with. She stepped closer, her sensible shoes silent on the Aubusson rug, and peered at the vanity. The lock on the case appeared intact, its brass surface unmarred by scratches or dents. "A professional job, perhaps," she murmured to herself, though her mind lingered on the simplicity of the act. A lock could be picked, or a key could be borrowed, or duplicated. Inspector Harrow turned his attention to the window, a tall casement set high in the wall, its latch undone and the glass pushed outward. He leaned out, his lantern casting a pale glow across the ivy-covered stone below. "No ladder marks," he said almost to himself, "and the ground's too firm for footprints." Odd that he straightened, brushing his hands together as if to dismiss the window as a possibility. No one could climb that without equipment, and there's none to be found. Miss Marple, however, was not so quick to dismiss the window. She noted its height, nearly 10 feet from the ground, and the narrow ledge outside, barely wide enough for a sparrow. The ivy, thick and ancient, might support a nimble climber, but the absence of broken stems or disturbed leaves suggested otherwise. She filed the thought away, her gaze drifting to the room's other details. The silver hairbrush, its bristles still holding a few strands of Lady Beatrice's auburn hair. The half-empty bottle of perfume, and a small embroidered cushion, slightly askew, as if someone had brushed against it in haste. The inspector turned to the gathered guests, his expression stern. "No one leaves the manor until we've sorted this out. I'll need statements from everyone who is near this room tonight." His eyes settled on Clara, the maid who stood by the door, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles gleamed white. "You, girl? Did you come in here during the gala?" Clara, a slight young woman with mousy hair tucked under a starched cap, flinched as if struck. "Only before the guests arrived, sir," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I tidied the room, set out her ladyship's things, and left. I was in the kitchens after that, helping with the trays." Her eyes flicked to the floor, avoiding the inspector's gaze, and Miss Marple noted the faint tremor in her fingers. "Nerves," she thought, "or something more. And you, Mr. Wells?" Inspector Harrow turned to the jeweller, who stood near the vanity, his hands clasped behind his back. Gideon Wells was a man of middle age, his hair neatly pomaded, his suit impeccable. His emerald cufflinks caught the lamplight, a subtle reminder of his trade. "I was in the library most of the evening," Wells said, his voice smooth and measured, "discussing gemstone cuts with Sir Reginald Brooke. I had no reason to come up here after appraising the necklace this afternoon." His eyes met the inspector's without wavering, but Miss Marple noticed a slight tightening of his jaw, as if he were holding back a thought. "And you, Mr. Finch?" The inspector's gaze shifted to Roland Finch, who lounged against the doorframe, his earlier charm replaced by a wary alertness. His dark eyes flicked to Lady Beatrice, then back to Harrow. "Dancing mostly," Finch said with a shrug that was almost too casual. "Ask anyone, Miss Langley, Miss Harrowby. They'll tell you I was on the floor all evening, hot work too. I stepped out for a cigarette around 9:30, but I was back in the ballroom before 10. His smile was quick, but it did not reach his eyes. And Miss Marple noted the way his fingers drummed lightly against his thigh. The inspector jotted down their responses, his pencil moving with the precision of a metronome. He turned back to Lady Beatrice. "Anyone else have access to this room? Any other keys?" "Only Clara," Lady Beatrice said, her voice firm now, as if regaining control. "She has a duplicate key for cleaning, but she's never used it without my permission." Her eyes softened as she looked at the maid, a gesture that struck Miss Marple as oddly protective. "Clara's been with me for years. I trust her completely." Clara's face flushed, and she ducked her head, murmuring something inaudible. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. Trust, in her experience, was often misplaced, especially when large sums were involved. The Ashford necklace she had overheard at tea was valued at £20,000, a sum that could tempt even the most loyal heart. Inspector Harrow dismissed the guests, instructing them to remain in the drawing-room while he continued his examination. As the crowd dispersed, Miss Marple lingered, her small figure blending into the shadows of the iron corridor. She approached the vanity, her eyes scanning the surface anew. A faint smudge of powder dusted the edge of the case, barely noticeable unless one looked closely. She leaned forward, her nose wrinkling at the faint scent of something unfamiliar, not jasmine, but something sharper, like lavender soap. Curious, she thought, straightening up. The maids at Greystone Manor used plain lye soap, not lavender. She moved to the window, her fingers brushing the sill. The latch was loose, but the mechanism was old, prone to slipping. She peered out, noting the sheer drop to the garden below. A thief from outside would need extraordinary skill, or inside help. Her mind turned to the suspects. Lady Beatrice, whose debts were whispered about in the village. Finch, whose charm masked a desperate need for funds. Wells, whose expertise made him a natural suspect in a jewel theft. And Clara, whose nervousness suggested more than simple fear of authority. As Inspector Harrow conferred with the constable, Miss Marple slipped into the corridor, her mind already weaving a pattern from the threads of what she had seen. The dressing room, with its locked case and open window, was a puzzle, but not an unsolvable one. People, she thought, are always the key. They leave traces, even when they think they don't. She recalled a similar case in St. Mary Mead, where a stolen brooch had turned up in a housemaid's sewing basket, hidden in plain sight. The memory brought a faint smile to her lips. "Let us see," she murmured, "what traces this thief has left." The corridor was now empty, save for a footman stationed at the far end. Miss Marple paused by a small table where a vase of lilies stood slightly off-centre, as if bumped. She adjusted it absently, her mind elsewhere. Clara's trembling hands, Finch's restless fingers, Wells's too perfect composure, each was a clue, small but significant. And Lady Beatrice herself, with her theatrical distress and protective glance at her maid, was not above suspicion. Miss Marple's knitting bag hung lightly on her arm, its contents undisturbed, but her thoughts were anything but idle. The emerald necklace was gone, but its absence was only the beginning. The real question, as always, was why and who. Chapter 3. The suspects emerged. The drawing-room of Greystone Manor, with its high ceilings and damask curtains, felt oppressively close as the guests were herded inside. Their earlier gaiety replaced by a restless unease. The fire crackled in the grate, casting flickering shadows on the walls where ancestral portraits gazed down with impassive judgment. Inspector Harrow stood before the hearth, his notebook now tucked away, his sharp eyes scanning the assembly like a hawk over a field. The emerald necklace's theft had transformed the gala into a stage for suspicion, and every guest seemed to feel the weight of unseen accusations. Miss Jane Marple, seated in a high-backed chair near a potted fern, her knitting needles moving with quiet rhythm, observed the room with her usual deceptive mildness. To the untrained eye, she was merely an elderly spinster, absorbed in her wool, but her mind was as keen as the needles in her hands, noting every gesture, every sidelong glance. Inspector Harrow cleared his throat, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "I'll need to speak with a few of you privately," he said, his tone clipped but authoritative. "Lady Ashford has named those who had opportunity or reason to be near the dressing room. The rest of you remain here until I call." He gestured to a footman to guard the door, then pointed to 4 figures. Lady Beatrice Ashford, Mr. Roland Finch, Mr. Gideon Wells, and Clara, the maid. Each reacted differently, and Miss Marple's eyes missed none of it. Lady Beatrice, standing near a marble-topped console, stiffened, her hand tightening around a crystal glass of water. Her distress, so evident in the dressing room, now seemed tempered by a certain defiance, as if she resented the implication of her involvement. Roland Finch, lounging on a velvet settee, raised an eyebrow, his lips curling into a faint sardonic smile that suggested he found the situation more amusing than threatening. Gideon Wells, the jeweller, stood rigidly by a bookcase, his fingers adjusting his emerald cufflinks with a precision that bordered on compulsive. And Clara, hovering near a side table laden with decanters, seemed to shrink into herself, her pale face half hidden by the shadow of her cap, her hands twisting a corner of her apron until the fabric threatened to tear. Miss Marple's needles paused as she studied Clara. The girl's nervousness was palpable, a raw edge that set her apart from the others' more calculated demeanours. Fear, Miss Marple thought, but of what? Guilt, or merely the weight of suspicion? She recalled a young housemaid in St. Mary Mead, who had trembled just so when accused of stealing a silver spoon, only to be found innocent when the spoon turned up in a magpie's nest. Clara's fear might mean guilt, or it might mean something else entirely. A secret unrelated to the necklace, perhaps, but no less telling. Inspector Harrow began with Lady Beatrice, ushering her into a small antechamber off the drawing-room. The door closed behind them, but Miss Marple's sharp ears caught the low murmur of voices. She turned her attention to the remaining suspects, who had drifted into separate corners of the room, as if physical distance could shield them from scrutiny. Finch lit a cigarette, the match flaring briefly in the dim light, and exhaled a plume of smoke that curled toward the ceiling. He caught Miss Marple's eye and offered a charming grin, but she noted the way his gaze flicked toward the antechamber door, as if gauging how long he had before his own interrogation. Wells, meanwhile, had picked up a leather-bound volume from the bookcase. Gibbon's Decline and Fall, Miss Marple noted with faint amusement, and pretended to read, though his eyes barely moved across the page. His composure was impeccable, yet there was a tension in his shoulders, a slight rigidity that suggested he was listening as much as he was pretending not to. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to his cufflinks again, emerald like the stolen necklace. A coincidence, perhaps, but in her experience, coincidences were often clues in disguise. Clara remained by the side table, her movements jerky as she rearranged a set of crystal glasses that needed no arranging. A footman approached to offer her a chair, but she shook her head, her lips pressed into a thin line. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her voice soft but clear. "My dear, you look quite pale." Perhaps a glass of water would help. Clara started, her eyes wide, as if she hadn't noticed Miss Marple until that moment. "Oh, thank you, ma'am, but I'm fine," she stammered, her fingers tightening on the apron. Miss Marple smiled gently, but her mind catalogued the girl's reaction. The quick flush, the averted gaze, the hands that could not stay still. The antechamber door opened, and Lady Beatrice emerged, her expression a mix of relief and lingering agitation. She crossed to a chaise longue and sank onto it, fanning herself with a lace handkerchief. Inspector Harrow followed, his face unreadable, and called for Roland Finch next. Finch stubbed out his cigarette and sauntered toward the antechamber, his nonchalance almost convincing. Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, but her attention remained on the room. A young woman in a pink gown, one of the debutantes who had danced with Finch, whispered to a companion, her words inaudible, but her glance toward Clara pointed. Miss Marple filed this away, suspecting this servant's gossip might prove as revealing as the suspect's alibis. When Finch returned, his smile was still in place, but his eyes were sharper, more guarded. Inspector Harrow called for Gideon Wells, who closed his book with a deliberate snap and followed without a word. Miss Marple noted the contrast, Finch's studied ease versus Wells's controlled precision. Both men were hiding something, she was certain, though whether it was theft or something less tangible remained to be seen. She thought of a case in St. Mary Mead, where a village doctor's too-perfect alibi had unravelled when his watch was found to be 5 minutes slow. A small detail, but enough to expose a lie. Details, she murmured to herself, are always the key. Clara was called last, and as she passed Miss Marple's chair, the older woman caught a faint whiff of lavender, not the jasmine of Lady Beatrice's perfume, but the same sharp scent she had noticed on the vanity. Clara's apron, she observed, was starched but slightly frayed at the hem, a sign of long service or frugality. As the girl disappeared into the antechamber, Miss Marple's mind turned to the village rumours about Clara's brother, a sailor who had left debts and whispers of trouble in Liverpool. Could Clara's nervousness stem from a family secret? Or was it the weight of a more immediate crime? The drawing-room had grown quieter now, the guests subdued by the weight and the flickering firelight. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily, a soothing counterpoint to the tension in the air. She thought of the dressing-room again. The empty case, the open window, the smudge of powder. Each was a piece of the puzzle, but the picture was still incomplete. Lady Beatrice's protectiveness toward Clara intrigued her. It suggested loyalty, but also a possible blind spot. Finch's debts made him an obvious suspect, yet his charm was a shield that could hide calculation. And Wells, with his jeweller's knowledge, might know how to dispose of a stolen gem without leaving a trace. As Clara emerged from the antechamber, her face was even paler, her eyes red-rimmed as if she had been crying. Inspector Harrow followed, his expression grim. "That's all for now," he said to the room, "but no one leaves the manor until I say so." "We'll resume in the morning." The guests murmured their assent, some with relief, others with unease. Clara slipped toward the servants' door, her steps quick and unsteady, and Miss Marple made a mental note to speak with her later, perhaps over a cup of tea, a setting that often loosened tongues. As the crowd began to disperse, Miss Marple remained in her chair, her knitting a quiet pretext for observation. The suspects had emerged, each with their own secrets, their own motives. People, she thought, are like skeins of wool, tangled until you find the right thread to pull. She would pull those threads one by one until the truth of the emerald necklace lay bare. For now, she tucked her knitting into her bag and rose, her small figure moving unnoticed toward the corridor, her mind already turning to the next step in unraveling the mystery. Chapter 4. The Hostess's Tale. The morning after the gala dawned grey and damp, with a mist clinging to the manicured lawns of Greystone Manor like a shroud. Inside, the atmosphere was no less heavy, the grandeur of the previous evening dimmed by the shadow of theft. Miss Jane Marple, having taken an early breakfast of tea and toast in the morning room, sat now in a quiet alcove off the main hall, her knitting bag at her side. The alcove, with its faded tapestry and single armchair, offered a discreet vantage point from which to observe the comings and goings of the household. Her needles moved steadily, but her eyes were alert, catching the subtle currents of tension that rippled through the manor. Lady Beatrice Ashford had agreed to meet Miss Marple privately, a request the hostess had accepted with a mixture of curiosity and reluctance. The two women now sat in a small parlour, its walls adorned with watercolours of pastoral scenes that seemed at odds with the present unease. Lady Beatrice, dressed in a sombre grey morning gown, sat erect on a chintz-covered sofa, her hands folded in her lap. The absence of the emerald necklace was stark, though a single pearl pendant hung at her throat, an understated substitute. Her auburn hair was pinned neatly, but there were faint shadows beneath her eyes, suggesting a sleepless night. "I do hope you can help, Miss Marple," Lady Beatrice began, her voice carrying the polished cadence of one accustomed to command. "This dreadful business with the necklace, it's more than a loss. It's a violation. That piece has been in the Ashford family for generations." Her fingers tightened briefly, then relaxed, as if she had caught herself betraying too much emotion. Miss Marple inclined her head, her expression one of gentle sympathy. "Of course, my dear. A theft like this is most distressing. Perhaps you could tell me exactly what happened last night. Every detail, however small, might be significant." Her tone was soft, almost coaxing, as if she were merely a concerned relative, rather than a keen observer of human nature. Lady Beatrice hesitated, her gaze drifting to the window, where the mist pressed against the panes. "It was just after 10, I believe," she said at last. "The gala was in full swing, and I was feeling a touch overwhelmed. The necklace, you see, it's heavy, and the clasp was pinching my neck. I decided to slip upstairs to my dressing room to refresh myself. I took off the necklace, placed it in its case, and locked it with the key I keep in my reticule. I was called away almost at once. Lord Pennington had arrived late, and as hostess, I had to greet him. I couldn't have been gone more than 10 minutes, perhaps 15. When I returned, the case was empty." Her voice trembled slightly on the last word, but her eyes remained dry, fixed on Miss Marple with an intensity that suggested she was watching for a reaction. Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking softly as she considered the account. "And you're certain you locked the case?" she asked, her tone mild but probing. "Absolutely," Lady Beatrice replied, a touch of indignation in her voice. "I'm not careless with such things. The key never left my reticule, and the lock was secure when I left the room." She reached for a small fan on the table beside her, snapping it open and closing it again, a gesture that betrayed a flicker of unease. Miss Marple's eyes followed the movement, noting the fan's ivory handle, worn smooth from frequent use. "And no one else entered the room while you were there?" Not Clara, perhaps, to assist you?" Lady Beatrice shook her head firmly. "No one." Clara had been in earlier to lay out my things, but she was in the kitchens by then, or so she told me. I was quite alone. Her voice softened, and she added almost as an afterthought, "Clara is a good girl, you know. She's been with me since she was 16. I can't imagine her involved in anything so dreadful." The defence of the maid was swift, almost too swift, and Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Of course," she murmured, her tone soothing. "Loyalty is a fine quality in a servant. But tell me, Lady Beatrice, had anyone shown particular interest in the necklace that evening? Mr. Wells, perhaps, or Mr. Finch?" Lady Beatrice's lips pursed, and for a moment she seemed to weigh her words. "Mr. Wells appraised it that afternoon," she said at last. "He was very professional, as always. He remarked on its clarity and value. £20,000, he said, though I dare say it's worth more to the family. As for Mr. Finch," she paused, her fingers tightening on the fan again. "He complimented it, as many did. He's a charming man, but I know his reputation. Debts, I'm told. Still, he was dancing all evening, wasn't he? Hardly the sort to slip away unnoticed." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her mind turning over the hostess's words. The defence of Clara, the careful dismissal of Finch's motives, it was all very smooth. Yet there was a guardedness in Lady Beatrice's manner that suggested she was holding something back. Miss Marple thought of a widow in St. Mary Mead, whose insistence on her gardener's innocence had masked her own fear of scandal. "People protect what they value," she mused, "sometimes at great cost. Had the necklace been insured?" Miss Marple asked, her tone as casual as if she were inquiring about the weather. The question was a delicate probe, for she had heard whispers in the village of Sir Henry Ashford's financial troubles, whispers that had not spared his widow. Lady Beatrice's eyes flickered, but she answered readily enough, "Yes, of course. My late husband insisted on it, though I loathe the thought of reducing such a piece to mere pounds and shillings. The insurance papers are with my solicitor in London." Her voice was firm, but Miss Marple noted the slight flush that crept into her cheeks, a telltale sign of discomfort. "And no one else had access to the dressing-room key?" Miss Marple pressed gently. "No one who might have borrowed it, even briefly?" "Only Clara, as I told the inspector," Lady Beatrice said, her tone sharpening. "And I trust her implicitly. The key was in my reticule, and the reticule was with me all evening." She snapped the fan shut with a decisive click, as if to close the subject. Miss Marple nodded, her expression unchanged, but her mind was busy. The reticule, she recalled, was a small silk affair, easily opened, easily rifled through in a moment of distraction. And Lady Beatrice's protectiveness toward Clara was striking, almost maternal, which was unusual for a woman of her station. Was it genuine loyalty, or was she shielding the maid for reasons of her own? Miss Marple thought of the smudge of powder on the vanity, the faint scent of lavender soap. Clara's presence in the dressing-room, however brief, could not be dismissed so easily. "Thank you, Lady Beatrice," Miss Marple said, rising from her chair with a small smile. "You've been most helpful. I'm sure the inspector will find the culprit soon." She gathered her knitting bag, her movements slow and deliberate, but her mind was racing. The hostess's tale was consistent, almost too consistent, and the mention of insurance had stirred a new thread of suspicion. debts, even those of a late husband, could weigh heavily on a widow, and an insured necklace might be a temptation too great to resist. As Lady Beatrice rose to return to her guests, Miss Marple lingered by the parlour door, her eyes catching a small detail. A faint crease in the chintz cushion where Lady Beatrice had sat, as if she had shifted uncomfortably during their talk. A small thing, Miss Marple thought, but small things often matter. She stepped into the hall, her mind already turning to the other suspects. Finch with his debts, Wells with his expertise, Clara with her trembling hands. Lady Beatrice's story was only the first piece of the puzzle, and Miss Marple was determined to find the others, one careful stitch at a time. Chapter 5. The Guest's Gambit. The late morning sun struggled through the heavy clouds over Greystone Manor, casting a pallid light across the oak-panelled library where Miss Jane Marple had settled with her knitting. The room, with its towering shelves of leather-bound tomes and the faint scent of old paper, was a haven of quiet amid the manor's lingering tension. The theft of the emerald necklace had left a stain on the household, and the guests, confined until Inspector Harrow's investigation progressed, moved with the restless unease of caged birds. Miss Marple, her needles clicking rhythmically, had chosen the library for its vantage point. From here she could observe the comings and goings of the suspects without drawing attention to herself. Her small figure, tucked into a worn leather armchair by a leaded window, was as unobtrusive as ever, but her mind was a hive of activity, piecing together the threads of the previous night's events. Roland Finch, the charming guest with a reputation for living beyond his means, had caught her interest from the start. His easy smile and quick wit had made him a favourite in the ballroom, but Miss Marple knew that charm often masked calculation. She had requested a private word with him, and he had agreed with a readiness that bordered on eagerness, as if he saw the conversation as a game to be played. They met in a small study adjoining the library, its walls lined with maps of the Ashford estate, and a single portrait of a stern-faced ancestor glaring down from above the fireplace. Finch lounged in a chair, one leg crossed carelessly over the other, his dark eyes glinting with a mix of amusement and wariness. "Miss Marple," he began, his voice smooth as polished wood, "I'm flattered by your interest, but I assure you, I'm no jewel thief. Dancing and a glass of champagne are more my line." He flashed a grin, but Miss Marple noted the slight tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers tapped lightly against the armrest. "Oh, I'm sure you're far too busy enjoying yourself to bother with such things," Miss Marple replied, her tone mild and her eyes crinkling with a smile that invited confidence. "But you were in the ballroom all evening, you say?" "It must have been a lively night. Very lively," Finch agreed, leaning back as if to distance himself from scrutiny. "I danced with Miss Langley, Miss Harrowby, even Lady Beatrice herself, for a turn or two. Hardly a moment to catch my breath, let alone sneak upstairs to pilfer jewels." His laugh was light, but Miss Marple's sharp ears caught a faint edge to it, like a note struck slightly off-key. She nodded, her needles pausing as she met his gaze. "And yet, I heard from one of the footmen that you stepped out for a cigarette around 9:30. Near the terrace, wasn't it? Not far from the dressing-room window." Her voice was gentle, almost apologetic, but her eyes were steady, watching for the flicker of reaction. Finch's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, but he recovered quickly. "A cigarette, yes. It was stifling in the ballroom, and I needed a moment's air. I was back inside before 10. Ask Miss Langley, she'll tell you. We danced the next waltz together. He spread his hands as if to show they were empty of guilt. Besides, that window's a good 10 feet up. I'm no acrobat. Miss Marple inclined her head, as if conceding the point. Of course. And you didn't notice anything unusual while you were outside? No one lurking about, perhaps, or anything out of place? She resumed her knitting, the soft click of the needles filling the brief silence. Nothing at all, Finch said, his tone firm. Just the usual garden shadows and the sound of the music drifting out. I smoked, stretched my legs, and went back in. That's the whole of it. But his fingers resumed their tapping, and Miss Marple noted the way his eyes flicked toward the door, as if he were eager to escape the conversation. She changed tack, her voice as soft as ever. You admired Lady Beatrice's necklace, I believe? A striking piece. I imagine it's the sort of thing that catches everyone's eye. Finch shrugged, his smile returning. Hard not to notice it. Green as a forest and worth a king's ransom, or so they say. I complimented her on it, as any gentleman would. But I'm not in the habit of coveting what I can't afford. His tone was light, but there was a hardness beneath it, a reminder of the debts that shadowed his name. Miss Marple's needles moved steadily, but her mind was elsewhere, recalling a young man in St. Mary Mead, who had charmed his way into a widow's parlour only to vanish with her silver. Charm, she knew, was a currency that could buy trust, or time, and Mr. Wells, she said, as if the thought had just occurred. Finch's expression shifted, a flicker of something, caution perhaps, or calculation, crossing his face. The jeweller? He was in the library, wasn't he? Talking shop with some old bore about gemstones. Not my sort of conversation. He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. Though I'll wager he knows more about that necklace than he lets on. A man like that, always weighing value in his head. Miss Marple nodded, her expression unchanged, but her interest piqued. The mention of Wells was unprompted, and Finch's quickness to point a finger elsewhere was telling. I'm sure he does, she said mildly. A jeweller's eye is trained to see value where others might not. She paused, then added, almost as an afterthought, You didn't happen to speak with him last night, did you? About the necklace, perhaps? Finch's smile tightened, and for a moment he seemed to weigh his response. Not about the necklace, no. We exchanged a word or two in passing. Something about a horse race, I think. Nothing more. He rose, smoothing his jacket. If you'll excuse me, Miss Marple, I should see if the inspector needs me. I'd hate to keep him waiting. His tone was polite, but there was a finality to it, as if he were closing a door. Miss Marple smiled, her eyes crinkling with apparent warmth. Of course, Mr. Finch. You've been most helpful. As he left the study, she watched him go, noting the slight haste in his step, the way he glanced over his shoulder as if to ensure he was not followed. A charming man, she murmured to herself, but charm is such a slippery thing. She remained in the study a moment longer, her knitting idle in her lap as she turned over Finch's words. His alibi was solid enough, corroborated by the debutantes, no doubt. But his absence from the ballroom, however brief, placed him near the scene of the crime. The terrace was indeed close to the dressing-room window, and while he was right about the height, Miss Marple knew that opportunity often required only a moment's boldness. and his mention of Wells, so casually dropped, felt like a deflection, a way to shift suspicion elsewhere. She thought of the smudge of powder on the vanity, the lavender scent that lingered in the dressing room. Finch was unlikely to use lavender soap, but his quickness to mention Wells suggested a connection, perhaps a shared secret or a rivalry. Miss Marple recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a young man's debts had led him to conspire with a local tradesman, only to betray him when the plan unravelled. Debts make strange allies, she thought, and stranger enemies. Rising from her chair, she tucked her knitting into her bag and stepped into the library, where a few guests lingered, their conversations hushed. Finch had rejoined them, his charm back in place as he chatted with a young woman in a lavender dress. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. Lavender again, though this was perfume, not soap. She made a mental note to inquire about the Manor's laundry practices. A Maid's soap might hold more clues than it seemed. As she moved toward the hall, her mind was already weaving the threads of Finch's story into the larger tapestry. His debts, his absence from the ballroom, his quickness to point to Wells, all were pieces of the puzzle, but none yet fit perfectly. Patience, Miss Marple thought, is the key to untangling a knot. She would speak to Wells next, and perhaps Clara again, for the truth, as always, lay in the small things, the glance, the gesture, the word left unsaid. Chapter 6. The Jeweller's Expertise. The afternoon light filtered weakly through the tall windows of Greystone Manor's conservatory, where exotic ferns and orchids thrived in a humid haze. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and blooming flowers, a stark contrast to the sterile tension that gripped the rest of the household. Miss Jane Marple had chosen this quiet corner for her next conversation, sensing that the lush, secluded setting might unsettle a man accustomed to the precision of his trade. Gideon Wells, the jeweller, had agreed to meet her here, his manner polite but guarded, as if he suspected her gentle demeanour hid a sharper intent. He was not wrong. Miss Marple sat on a wrought-iron bench, her knitting bag at her side, her needles moving with their usual steady rhythm. The conservatory's glass walls gave her a clear view of the gravel path outside, where a gardener trimmed hedges with methodical snips. She noted the rhythm of his work, so like her own knitting, deliberate, unhurried, revealing patterns over time. Wells entered, his suit as immaculate as ever, his emerald cufflinks catching the muted light. He carried himself with the air of a man who knew his worth, his hands clasped behind his back as he surveyed the room before settling into a chair opposite her. "Miss Marple," he began, his voice smooth and measured, like a man accustomed to dealing with discerning clients. "I understand you're assisting the inspector in this unfortunate matter. I'm happy to help, though I'm not sure what more I can add to my statement." His smile was polite, but his eyes were watchful, assessing her as one might a rare gem under a loupe. "Oh, I'm sure you have much to offer, Mr. Wells," Miss Marple replied, her tone as mild as a spring breeze. "A man of your expertise must see things others miss. Tell me, what was your impression of the Ashford necklace when you appraised it yesterday?" Her needles clicked softly, a soothing counterpoint to the faint rustle of leaves around them. Wells leaned back slightly, his fingers adjusting one of his cufflinks. An unconscious habit, Miss Marple noted. "A remarkable piece," he said. 17 emeralds, each of exceptional, clarity, set in gold filigree from the late Georgian period. I estimated its value at £20,000, though in the right auction it could fetch more. Lady Beatrice was quite proud of it, and rightly so. His tone was professional, almost detached, but Miss Marple caught a flicker of something, admiration perhaps, or envy, in his eyes. "And you saw it just before the gala?" she asked, her voice gentle but probing. "In the dressing-room, I presume?" "Yes," Wells confirmed. "Lady Beatrice asked me to appraise it there, around 4 o'clock. I examined it thoroughly, checked the settings, the clasp, the stones themselves. Everything was in order. I left it in her care and went to prepare for the evening." He paused, then added, "I was in the library most of the night, as I told the inspector. Sir Reginald Brooke kept me there with endless questions about gem-cutting. A tedious man, but a useful alibi. His smile was thin, almost self-deprecating, but Miss Marple noted the careful choice of words. "Quite so," she said, her eyes crinkling with a smile that invited confidence. "The library is a good distance from the dressing-room, isn't it? No chance you slipped away during the gala, perhaps to check on something?" Her tone was light, almost playful, but her gaze was steady, watching for any crack in his composure. Wells's smile tightened, and for a moment his fingers stilled on his cufflink. "None at all," he said firmly. "I was with Sir Reginald until nearly 11, when the commotion began. You can ask him yourself. He'll bore you with the details of our talk." He leaned forward slightly, his voice lowering. "If I may be frank, Miss Marple, I deal in jewels, not theft. Stealing a piece like that would be far more trouble than it's worth. The market for such a distinctive item is small, and the risk enormous." Miss Marple nodded, as if satisfied. But her mind was busy. His alibi was solid, corroborated by a witness, yet his precision felt almost too rehearsed, like a man who had prepared his lines in advance. She thought of a jeweller in St. Mary Mead, whose meticulous records had hidden a side trade in smuggled goods. "Expertise," she mused, "can be a mask as well as a tool." She shifted slightly, her needles pausing as she changed tack. "Those cufflinks of yours, Mr. Wells," she said, her tone conversational. "Emeralds, aren't they? Quite striking. A gift, perhaps, or a memento of your work." Wells glanced at his cuffs, his expression softening briefly. "A gift from a client years ago. Modest stones, nothing like the Ashford emeralds, but I'm fond of them." He adjusted one again, a gesture Miss Marple now recognized as a tic, a small tell of discomfort. "I suppose they caught your eye, being a lady with an appreciation for detail." "Oh, I notice all sorts of things," Miss Marple said, her smile disarming, "like the way a room smells, or the dust on a vanity. Did you happen to notice anything unusual in the dressing-room when you were there? A scent, perhaps, or something out of place?" Her question was casual, but her eyes were sharp, watching for the slightest shift in his demeanour. Wells hesitated, his fingers pausing mid-adjustment. "Nothing unusual," he said after a moment. "Just Lady Beatrice's perfume, jasmine, I think, and the usual clutter of a lady's dressing table. I was focused on the necklace, not the room." His tone was even, but Miss Marple noted the way his gaze flicked to the side as if recalling or avoiding something. She nodded, her needles resuming their rhythm. "Of course. And you didn't see anyone else near the dressing-room later that evening? Mr. Finch, perhaps, or Clara?" She dropped the names lightly, as if they were afterthoughts, but her eyes never left his face. Finch? Wells's eyebrows rose slightly, a hint of disdain in his voice. I saw him in the ballroom, charming the debutantes, as usual. As for Clara, I wouldn't know. Maids are invisible to me unless they're serving tea. He smiled, but it was a cold smile, and Miss Marple sensed a calculated distance in his words. She thought of Finch's quick mention of Wells in their earlier conversation, the way he had pointed to the jeweller as a potential suspect. Now Wells was returning the favour, dismissing Finch with a sneer. A pattern, she thought, of deflection. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where two men had accused each other of theft to hide their own collusion. Could Finch and Wells be playing a similar game, or was their mutual suspicion genuine? "Thank you, Mr. Wells," Miss Marple said, rising with a small smile. "You've been most helpful. I'm sure the inspector will appreciate your clarity." She gathered her knitting bag, her movements slow and deliberate, but her mind was racing. Wells's expertise made him a natural suspect. He would know how to handle a stolen gem, how to break it down or sell it discreetly. Yet his alibi was airtight, and his manner, while guarded, showed no obvious cracks. As Wells stood to leave, he paused at the conservatory door, turning back with a polite nod. "If I may say, Miss Marple, you have a keen eye. I hope it serves the inspector well." His tone was courteous, but there was a challenge in his eyes, as if he knew she was more than she seemed. "Oh, I'm just an old woman who likes to notice things," Miss Marple replied, her smile as gentle as ever. But as he left, she watched his retreating figure, noting the measured pace of his steps, the way his hand lingered on his cufflink one last time. A man who knows the value of control, she thought, but even control can slip. She remained in the conservatory a moment longer, her knitting idle as she turned over Wells's words. The scent of lavender soap in the dressing room, the smudge of powder, the open window, all were pieces of a puzzle that refused to align. Wells's expertise was undeniable, but his role in the theft was still unclear. Was he the architect, the opportunist, or merely a bystander with unfortunate timing? Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to Clara, whose nervousness seemed to grow with each encounter, and to Finch, whose charm was a shield she had yet to pierce. "The truth," she murmured, "is always in the details." She would need to look closer, at the people, at the places, at the small things that others overlooked. Chapter 7. The Maid's Secret. The late afternoon light cast long shadows across the polished floors of Greystone Manor, where the air held a quiet tension, like the hush before a storm. Miss Jane Marple had retreated to the servants' hall, a narrow, low-ceilinged room tucked behind the kitchens, where the scent of beeswax polish mingled with the faint tang of cooking fires. It was a place rarely visited by guests, but Miss Marple, with her knack for slipping into the margins of a household, had secured an invitation for tea with the housekeeper, Mrs. Grimsby. Her real purpose, however, was to observe Clara, the maid whose nervous demeanour had become a thread Miss Marple was determined to follow. Her knitting bag rested on the table beside her, its contents untouched, as she sipped a cup of strong, unsweetened tea, her mild eyes taking in the room's modest furnishings and the subdued bustle of the staff. Clara moved about the hall, clearing away plates from the servants' meal with a mechanical efficiency that did little to mask her unease. Her grey uniform was crisp, but Miss Marple noted a faint stain on the cuff of her sleeve. Grease, perhaps, or something less innocent. The girl's hands, small and work-roughened, trembled slightly as she stacked dishes, and her eyes darted toward the door whenever a footman passed. Miss Marple, with her talent for putting others at ease, waited until Clara was near before speaking. "Clara, my dear," she said, her voice as gentle as a summer breeze, "you look quite worn out. All this fuss over the necklace must be dreadful for you. Won't you sit a moment and have a cup of tea?" She gestured to an empty chair, her smile warm but her gaze keen. Clara hesitated, her lips parting as if to protest, but Mrs. Grimsby, a stout woman with a no-nonsense air, nodded her approval. "Go on, girl. You've been on your feet all day," she said, her tone gruff but kind. Clara perched on the edge of the chair, her hands folded tightly in her lap, as if afraid they might betray her. "Thank you, ma'am," Clara murmured, her voice barely audible. She accepted a cup of tea but did not drink, her fingers gripping the saucer instead. Miss Marple noted the faint tremor, the way Clara's eyes avoided hers, settling instead on the table's worn surface. "It must be trying, working in such a grand house during all this excitement," Miss Marple said, her tone conversational. "I imagine you see more than most, being in and out of rooms all day. Did you notice anything unusual last night, perhaps when you were tidying the dressing room?" Clara's shoulders stiffened, and her saucer rattled slightly. "No, ma'am," she said quickly. "I was only in there before the gala, to set out her ladyship's things. I didn't go back after that. I was in the kitchens, helping with the trays, like I told the inspector." Her words came in a rush, as if rehearsed, and Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted slightly at the repetition. "Of course," she said, her voice soothing. "But you have the duplicate key to the dressing room, don't you? It must be a great responsibility, handling such valuable things." She paused, her needles clicking softly as she resumed her knitting, the sound a gentle rhythm in the quiet room. Clara's face flushed, and she nodded. "Yes, ma'am, but I keep it safe. It's always in my pocket, and I never lend it out. Her ladyship trusts me with it." Her voice held a note of pride, but also a defensive edge, and Miss Marple noted the way her hand slipped to her apron pocket as if to confirm the key's presence. "I'm sure she does," Miss Marple said, her smile encouraging. "Lady Beatrice speaks very highly of you." But keys can be tricky things, can't they? So small, so easily mislaid, or borrowed, perhaps for just a moment. Her tone was light, but her eyes were steady, watching for the flicker of reaction. Clara's hand froze on her pocket, and for a moment her eyes met Miss Marple's, wide with something akin to panic. "I never let it out of my sight, ma'am," she said, her voice rising slightly. "No one could have taken it without me knowing." She set the saucer down, her movements jerky, and Miss Marple caught a faint whiff of lavender soap, the same scent she had noticed on the vanity in the dressing room. Miss Marple nodded, as if satisfied, but her mind was racing. Clara's insistence on the key's security was adamant, yet her nervousness suggested more than simple fear of suspicion. Miss Marple recalled a maid in St. Mary Mead, whose brother's gambling debts had driven her to pilfer small items from her employer's home, each theft a desperate bid to save him. Clara's brother, the sailor, came to mind, a man rumoured to have fled Liverpool under a cloud of debt. Could Clara's loyalty to him be her secret, And the necklace her means of escape? You must know the manor so well, Miss Marple said, changing tack, all its nooks and crannies. I imagine you could slip in and out of rooms without anyone noticing. Not that you would, of course, she added quickly, her smile disarming. But it must be tempting sometimes to know so much about the household. Clara's flush deepened, and she shook her head. I just do my work, ma'am. I don't pry or wander where I'm not wanted. Her voice was low, almost a whisper, and her eyes darted to Mrs. Grimsby, who was now at the far end of the hall, giving instructions to a footman. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur. Of course, my dear, but you must hear things, working so closely with Lady Beatrice. Did anyone mention the necklace last night? Mr. Finch, perhaps, or Mr. Wells? She dropped the names casually, watching Clara's face for any sign of recognition. Clara's fingers tightened in her lap, and she hesitated before answering. Mr. Finch. He said it was a fine piece when he was talking to her ladyship in the ballroom. Everyone was admiring it. Mr. Wells, he only spoke to me about the silver polish earlier in the day, nothing about the necklace. Her words were careful, but Miss Marple noted the slight pause before she mentioned Wells, as if weighing how much to reveal. And no one else was near the dressing room when you were there. Miss Marple pressed gently. No one lingering in the corridor, perhaps, or asking about her ladyship's things. Clara shook her head, but her eyes flicked to the floor, and Miss Marple sensed a wall going up. No, ma'am. I was alone, and then I went to the kitchens. That's all I know. She stood abruptly, smoothing her apron. I should get back to my duties, if you'll excuse me. Of course, Miss Marple said, her smile unchanged. You've been very kind to humour an old woman's questions. As Clara hurried away, Miss Marple watched her go, noting the quickness of her steps, the way her hand remained in her pocket, as if guarding the key or something else. She remained in the servants' hall a moment longer, her knitting idle as she sipped her now cold tea. Clara's secret, she was certain, was tied to her nervousness, her guarded answers, the lavender scent that linked her to the dressing room. The key was a crucial piece of the puzzle, but whether Clara had used it herself or allowed someone else to borrow it remained unclear. Miss Marple thought of Lady Beatrice's protectiveness, Finch's deflection toward Wells, and Wells's own precise composure. Each suspect was a thread, but Clara's was the most frayed, the most likely to unravel with a gentle tug. As she gathered her knitting bag and rose, Miss Marple's mind turned to the manor's layout, the dressing room's proximity to the servants' stairs, the ease with which a maid could move unnoticed. A secret, she murmured, is a heavy burden, especially for the young. She would need to watch Clara closely, perhaps catch her off guard in a less formal setting. The truth, as always, lay in the small things, the trembling hand, the averted glance, the scent of lavender that lingered like a ghost. Chapter 8. A Clue in the Garden. The mist that had cloaked Greystone Manor's gardens in the early morning had lifted by noon, leaving the air crisp and the lawns sparkling with dew. Miss Jane Marple, wrapped in a shawl against the autumn chill, strolled along the gravel paths, her sensible shoes crunching softly as she admired the late-blooming roses. To any observer, she was merely an elderly guest taking a turn in the garden, her knitting bag slung over her arm, and her expression one of mild contentment. But her eyes, sharp and clear beneath the brim of her hat, scanned the grounds with purpose, seeking traces of the truth behind the emerald necklace's disappearance. The garden, she knew, held secrets as surely as the manor's rooms, and she intended to find them. The path led her to the west side of the house, where the dressing-room's high window overlooked a bed of chrysanthemums and a neatly trimmed hedge. The window, still slightly ajar as Inspector Harrow had left it, was a focal point of the mystery. A tantalizing possibility that the thief had entered or exited from outside. Miss Marple paused, her gaze tracing the ivy that clung to the stone wall beneath the window, its tendrils thick but undisturbed. The ground below was firm as the inspector had noted, with no telltale footprints or crushed plants to suggest a ladder or a fall. Yet something caught her eye. A single thorn bush, tucked against the hedge, bore a scrap of white lace snagged on its spines, fluttering faintly in the breeze. She bent closer, careful not to disturb the bush, and examined the lace with a practiced eye. It was fine but sturdy, the kind used for a servant's apron rather than a lady's gown. Her lips pursed slightly as she recalled Clara's starched uniform, its hem frayed, but its apron adorned with a narrow band of lace. "Curious," she murmured, extracting a small pair of scissors from her knitting bag to snip the lace free. She tucked it into a handkerchief, folding it carefully as if it were as precious as the missing necklace itself. A small thing, but small things often speak loudest. Miss Marple straightened, her gaze returning to the window. Its height, nearly 10 feet from the ground, made an outside entry improbable without equipment, and the absence of ladder marks or broken ivy confirmed Inspector Harrow's assessment. Yet the lace suggested someone had been here, close enough to the bush to leave a trace. She thought of Clara's nervous hands, her insistence that she had not been near the dressing room after her morning duties. A maid moves freely, Miss Marple mused, where others might be noticed. She continued her walk, circling the manor to observe the other paths leading from the dressing-room's vicinity. The gravel was well raked, but near a side gate she noticed a faint scuff in the dirt, as if someone had stepped off the path in haste. It was not a footprint, merely a disturbance, but it was enough to pique her interest. The gate led to the servants' entrance, a route Clara would know well. Miss Marple filed the observation away, her mind turning to the other suspects. Roland Finch had claimed to be on the terrace, smoking a cigarette, but the terrace was on the opposite side of the manor, too far to explain the lace. Gideon Wells, with his library alibi, had no reason to be in the garden at all, and Lady Beatrice, confined to her hostess duties, was unlikely to have ventured outside during the gala. Returning to the chrysanthemum bed, Miss Marple sat on a stone bench, her knitting bag at her side. She opened it, not to knit, but to examine the lace again under the daylight. Its weave was simple, machine-made, common enough for a servant's uniform, but distinct from the delicate hand-worked lace of a lady's attire. She thought of the lavender scent in the dressing-room, the smudge of powder on the vanity, details that pointed to Clara, yet did not fully condemn her. A maid with a key, she thought, and a reason to be near the window. But why the garden, and why the haste? Her reverie was interrupted by the sound of footsteps on the gravel. Clara herself appeared, carrying a basket of linens toward the servants' entrance. The girl's face was pale, her eyes shadowed, and she started slightly at the sight of Miss Marple. "Oh, ma'am," she said, her voice unsteady. "I didn't see you there." "Are you enjoying the garden?" "Very much, my dear," Miss Marple replied, her smile warm but her eyes watchful. "It's so peaceful out here, away from all the fuss." "Though I imagine you've little time for strolling, with all your duties." She gestured to the basket, noting the way Clara's grip tightened on its handle. "Yes, ma'am," Clara said, her gaze dropping to the ground. "There's always work to be done." She hesitated, as if unsure whether to stay or flee, and Miss Marple seized the moment. "I found something curious just now," she said, her tone light, almost absent-minded. She unfolded the handkerchief to reveal the scrap of lace, holding it up so the sunlight caught its threads. "Snagged on a thorn bush, near the dressing-room window. It's rather like the lace on your apron, isn't it?" Clara's face drained of what little colour it had, and her hands clutched the basket as if it were a lifeline. I don't know, ma'am," she stammered. "Lots of aprons have lace." "It could be anyone's." Her voice was high, almost pleading, and Miss Marple noted the way her eyes flicked toward the window above, then back to the ground. "Of course," Miss Marple said, folding the handkerchief and tucking it away. "Just a coincidence, I'm sure, but it's odd, isn't it, how things turn up in unexpected places. Like a necklace, perhaps, or a key." Her tone was gentle, but her words were a probe, testing the girl's resolve. Clara swallowed hard, her fingers trembling. "I don't know anything about the necklace, ma'am," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I swear it." She turned abruptly, hurrying toward the servants' entrance, her basket swaying as if she could not bear to stand still. Miss Marple watched her go, her expression thoughtful. Clara's reaction was telling, fear, certainly, but also a kind of desperation that suggested more than simple guilt. She thought of the rumours about Clara's brother, the sailor who had fled Liverpool with debts unpaid. A necklace worth £20,000 could buy a new life, far from creditors or a servant's drudgery. "A motive," Miss Marple murmured, "but not yet proof." She rose from the bench, her shawl drawn close, and resumed her walk, her mind weaving the new clue into the pattern. The lace placed Clara near the dressing-room window, contradicting her claim of being in the kitchens all evening. Yet the window itself remained a puzzle. Too high for easy access, too clean for a forced entry. Miss Marple recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a stolen locket had been found in a garden shed, hidden by a servant who had acted on impulse. People act rashly, she thought, when they're desperate. As she neared the manor's entrance, she glanced back at the dressing-room window, its glass glinting in the weak sunlight. The lace was a thread, but it was not the whole tapestry. Lady Beatrice's protectiveness, Finch's debts, Wells's expertise, all were pieces that needed to fit. Miss Marple's steps were slow, but her mind was swift, already planning her next move. She would need to speak to Inspector Harrow, perhaps suggest a closer look at the servants' quarters. The truth, as always, was in the small things. The scrap of lace, the scent of lavender, the shadow of a secret that could not stay hidden forever. Chapter 9. The Alibis Unravel. The drawing-room of Greystone Manor, bathed in the soft glow of afternoon light, filtering through heavy drapes, buzzed with a subdued restlessness. The guests, still confined by Inspector Harrow's orders, lingered in clusters, their conversations a low hum punctuated by the occasional clink of teacups. Miss Jane Marple sat near a bay window, her knitting needles moving with their familiar rhythm, though her eyes were far from idle. The scrap of lace from the garden, now safely tucked in her handkerchief, weighed on her mind, a tangible clue that pointed to Clara, but left the larger puzzle incomplete. The morning's discoveries had sharpened her focus, and she sensed the threads of the mystery were beginning to fray, revealing glimpses of the truth beneath. Inspector Harrow, his moustache bristling with purpose, had reconvened the key suspects in the drawing room for further questioning. His notebook was open, its pages filled with meticulous notes, and his expression was one of grim determination. Miss Marple, though not officially part of the investigation, had been permitted to observe, her quiet presence overlooked by most but not by Harrow, who had begun to value her knack for noticing what he missed. He stood before the fireplace, its embers glowing faintly, and addressed the room with a voice that brooked no nonsense. "We've established the necklace was taken between 10 and 10:15 last night," he said, his eyes sweeping over Lady Beatrice, Roland Finch, Gideon Wells, and Clara, who stood in a tense semicircle. "Each of you had opportunity, or so it seems. I want to hear your movements again, and this time I'll have no omissions." His gaze lingered on Finch, whose debts made him the inspector's prime suspect, but Miss Marple noted that Harrow's attention did not extend to the subtler signs she had observed. Lady Beatrice, seated on a velvet chair, spoke first, her voice steady but tinged with weariness. "As I told you, Inspector, I left the necklace in its case, locked, and went to greet Lord Pennington. I was back within 15 minutes, and it was gone." Her hands were folded in her lap, but Miss Marple saw a slight tremor, as if the strain of the ordeal was wearing through her composure. Harrow nodded, jotting a note, then turned to Finch, who leaned against a bookcase with an air of studied nonchalance. "And you, Mr. Finch, you claim you were dancing, but we've a witness, a footman, who saw you leave the ballroom around 9:30. Care to explain?" Finch's smile was quick, almost defiant. "I've explained already, Inspector. I stepped out for a cigarette on the terrace. 5 minutes, perhaps 10. I was back for the next waltz. Miss Langley will confirm it." His eyes flicked to a young woman in a pale green dress, who nodded hesitantly from across the room. Miss Marple noted the glance, and the way Finch's fingers drummed lightly on the bookcase, betraying a nervousness his smile concealed. Harrow's eyes narrowed. "The terrace is a fair walk from the dressing-room, but not impossible. And your debts, Mr. Finch? £20,000 would go a long way to clearing them, wouldn't it?" Finch's smile tightened, but he shrugged. "I won't deny I owe a bit here and there. But stealing a necklace like that? Too much trouble for a man like me. Besides, I'd need a buyer, and I'm no jeweller." His gaze slid toward Gideon Wells, a subtle jab that did not go unnoticed. Wells, standing near a side table, stiffened, his fingers adjusting his emerald cufflinks with a precision that Miss Marple now recognized as a habit under pressure. "I was in the library," he said before Harrow could prompt him, his voice as smooth as ever. "Sir Reginald Brooke will vouch for me." We discussed gemstone facets until the commotion began. I had no reason to go near the dressing-room after my appraisal. His tone was confident, but Miss Marple caught a fleeting glance toward Finch, as if the two men were locked in a silent duel. Harrow turned to Clara, who stood at the edge of the group, her hands twisting in her apron. "And you, girl? You say you were in the kitchens. but a footman claims he saw you in the upstairs corridor, near the dressing room, during the gala. Care to explain that?" Clara's face went ashen, and her voice trembled as she spoke. I wasn't there, sir. I was in the kitchens, like I said. The footman must be mistaken. I only went to the dressing room before the gala, to tidy up." Her eyes darted to Lady Beatrice as if seeking rescue, and Miss Marple noted the hostess's slight nod, a gesture of reassurance that seemed almost too protective. Harrow's moustache twitched, a sign of his growing frustration. "Mistaken, you say? We'll see about that. I'll have the footman in here later to clarify." He snapped his notebook shut, his gaze sweeping the group. "Someone's lying, and I'll find out who. For now, you're all to stay put." As the suspects dispersed, Miss Marple remained by the window, her knitting a pretext for lingering. Clara's contradiction of the footman's account was significant, especially paired with the lace in the garden. She thought of the lavender scent, the smudge of powder, details that pointed to the maid, yet lacked the clarity of proof. Finch's absence from the ballroom, though brief, kept him in the frame, and his quickness to implicate Wells suggested a deeper connection. Wells's alibi, while solid, felt too polished, like a gem cut to hide its flaws. Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by a low conversation near the fireplace, where Finch had drawn Wells aside. Their voices were hushed, but she caught fragments, something about a deal, and keeping quiet. She strained to hear more, but they moved out of earshot, their postures tense. A shared secret, she mused, or a shared suspicion. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where two men had accused each other of theft to mask their joint scheme. Could Finch and Wells be colluding, or was their mutual distrust genuine? She rose, her knitting bag in hand, and approached Inspector Harrow, who was conferring with a constable. "Inspector," she said, her voice soft but clear. "Might I suggest speaking to the footman again?" His account of Clara's movements could be crucial, and perhaps a closer look at the servants' quarters. Maids often keep personal items that tell a story. Harrow's eyes narrowed, but he nodded. "You've a sharp mind, Miss Marple. I'll have the footman questioned, and we'll search the quarters if need be. Anything else catch your eye?" She hesitated, then said, "Only that people rarely lie without reason." Clara's nervous, but so is Mr. Finch, in his way. "And Mr. Wells, his calm is almost too perfect. Keep an eye on their interactions, Inspector. Secrets have a way of slipping out when people think they're safe." Harrow grunted, a grudging acknowledgement, and turned back to his constable. Miss Marple moved toward the door, her mind weaving the new threads into the pattern. The footman's testimony could confirm Clara's presence near the dressing room, and the lace tied her to the garden. Finch's debts and Wells's expertise remained potent motives, but their whispered exchange hinted at something more. A partnership, perhaps, or a betrayal. The alibis are unraveling, she thought, and with them, the truth. As she stepped into the hall, her eyes caught Clara slipping toward the servants' stairs, her apron pocket bulging slightly. Miss Marple's lips pursed. The maid's secret was close to the surface, and with it, perhaps, the key to the emerald necklace's fate. She would need to act carefully, but the puzzle was beginning to take shape, one small stitch at a time. Chapter 10. The Necklace's Double. The waning light of the afternoon cast a soft glow through the tall windows of Greystone Manor's morning room, where Miss Jane Marple sat with a cup of tea, her knitting bag resting on the table beside her. The room, with its chintz curtains and delicate porcelain, was a haven of calm amidst the storm of suspicion that gripped the household. The theft of the emerald necklace had woven a web of doubt around the suspects, and Miss Marple, with her quiet persistence, was determined to untangle it. Her morning's discoveries, the lace in the garden, Clara's faltering alibi, and the whispered exchange between Finch and Wells had sharpened her focus. Now a new thread had emerged, one that promised to shift the pattern of the mystery. Lady Beatrice had invited the remaining guests for afternoon tea, a gesture of civility that felt strained under the weight of the ongoing investigation. The table was set with silver and fine china, but the conversation was subdued, punctuated by the clink of spoons and the occasional murmur of unease. Miss Marple, seated near the window, observed the suspects with her usual deceptive mildness. Lady Beatrice presided with practised grace, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of strain. Roland Finch, his charm undimmed, chatted lightly with the debutante, but his glances toward Wells were sharp, almost wary. Gideon Wells himself sat apart, sipping his tea with the precision of a man measuring his every move. Clara, serving the tea with downcast eyes, moved like a shadow, her hands steady but her face pale. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to a conversation she had overheard in St. Mary Mead, where a jeweller had spoken of crafting paste replicas to protect valuable gems from theft. The idea had lingered, and now, as she watched Lady Beatrice touch the pearl pendant at her throat, a poor substitute for the lost emeralds, she decided to test the waters. Leaning toward her hostess, she spoke in a low, conversational tone, as if sharing a village anecdote. "Lady Beatrice," she said, her voice carrying just far enough to reach the others, "I recall a story from my village about a lady who had a replica made of her diamond tiara. Paste, you know, but so cleverly done no one could tell. She wore it to parties and kept the real one safe. Quite sensible, don't you think, for such a valuable piece as your necklace?" The effect was immediate. Lady Beatrice's teacup paused halfway to her lips, and a faint flush crept into her cheeks. "A replica," she said, her voice a touch too sharp. "The Ashford necklace was no paste, Miss Marple. It was genuine, every stone. I'd know the difference." Her hand tightened on the cup, and Miss Marple noted the defensive edge in her tone, as if the suggestion had struck a nerve. "Of course," Miss Marple said, her smile placating. "I only thought it a clever precaution with such a treasure. But you're quite right. No one could mistake those emeralds." Her eyes flicked to Wells, who had set his cup down abruptly, his fingers brushing his cufflinks in that familiar gesture of unease. Finch, too, seemed to stiffen, his smile faltering as he glanced at Wells, then quickly away. The conversation moved on, but the seed had been planted. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind racing. Lady Beatrice's reaction suggested she had never considered a replica, or perhaps feared the implication that one might exist. Wells's discomfort, however, was more telling. A jeweller would know the art of crafting fakes, and his expertise could make such a deception possible. Finch's glance at Wells hinted at a shared knowledge, perhaps a plan gone awry. Miss Marple recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a stolen brooch had been replaced with a paste copy, the theft discovered only when the owner tried to sell it. "A double," she mused, "changes everything." As the tea concluded, Miss Marple excused herself, ostensibly to fetch a shawl, but her true destination was the Manor's telephone room, a small alcove near the library. She had noticed Wells slipping away earlier, his steps quick and purposeful, and had overheard a fragment of a conversation, a hushed voice speaking of moving the item. The telephone room, with its single line and polished oak desk, was a place where secrets might be shared, and Miss Marple was determined to learn more. She reached the alcove just as Wells emerged, his face composed, but his eyes sharp with alertness. He started slightly at the sight of her, then offered a polite nod. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice smooth. "Lost your way?" "Oh no," she replied, her smile disarming. "I thought I might telephone my niece and saint." "Mary Mead, but I see the line is busy. Did you manage your call?" Her tone was innocent, but her eyes were watchful, noting the faint sheen of perspiration on his brow. "Just a business matter," Wells said, his hand adjusting a cufflink. "Nothing to do with this unpleasantness." He moved past her, his steps measured, but Miss Marple caught the faint tremor in his voice, a crack in his polished facade. She lingered in the alcove, her fingers brushing the telephone's receiver. The desk held a notepad, its top sheet blank but bearing faint impressions, as if someone had written on the page above. She took a pencil from her bag and lightly rubbed it across, the paper revealing fragments of words. "Tonight, discreet, London." Her lips pursed. A jeweller with contacts in London could indeed move a stolen item, but a paste replica would complicate matters, requiring a buyer unaware of the deception or complicit in it. Returning to the drawing room, Miss Marple resumed her seat, her knitting needles moving as her mind wove the new clue into the pattern. The idea of a replica opened new possibilities. Had the real necklace been stolen, or was a fake now in its place, with the original hidden elsewhere? Lady Beatrice's denial suggested she believed the stolen piece genuine, but Wells's expertise made him a candidate for crafting a double. Finch's debts could drive him to collude in such a scheme, and Clara's nervousness might stem from being an unwitting pawn or a knowing one. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the lace in the garden, the lavender scent, the smudge of powder. Clara remained the most likely link to the dressing room, but the telephone note pointed to Wells as a potential mastermind. Finch's role was less clear. Was he a partner, a rival, or merely a distraction? She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a stolen painting had been replaced with a forgery, the thief betting on the delay in discovery. A clever trick, she thought, but tricks require trust, and trust is fragile. As the guests began to disperse, Miss Marple caught sight of Clara clearing the tea things, her movements quick and furtive. The girl's apron pocket still bulged slightly, and Miss Marple made a mental note to suggest a search of the servants' quarters to Inspector Harrow. The necklace's double, if it existed, might still be in the manor, hidden in a place only a maid would know. "The truth," she murmured, "is like a knot. Pull the right thread, and it all comes undone." She would need to act soon, before the thief, or thieves, could cover their tracks. Chapter 11. The Trap is Set. The evening shadows lengthened across Greystone Manor's grand hall, where the chandeliers, now dimmed, cast a muted glow over the polished marble floor. The air was thick with anticipation, as if the house itself sensed the unravelling of its secrets. Miss Jane Marple, seated in a corner armchair with her knitting bag at her side, had spent the day weaving the threads of the mystery. The lace in the garden, the lavender scent, the telephone note, and the possibility of a paste replica, into a pattern that was nearly complete. The suspects, though outwardly composed, moved with the wariness of players in a game they could not fully control. Miss Marple, with her quiet persistence, was ready to make her next move. She had confided her suspicions to Inspector Harrow over a discreet cup of tea in the library, suggesting a plan to flush out the thief. "People under pressure make mistakes," she had said, her voice soft but certain. "Announce that a witness saw the thief near the dressing room, and watch how they react. Guilt has a way of betraying itself." Harrow, initially sceptical, had warmed to the idea, recognizing the value of her insight. Now, as the guests gathered for dinner, he stood at the head of the dining room, his moustache bristling with authority, ready to set the trap. "Ladies and gentlemen," Harrow began, his voice cutting through the clatter of silver and crystal. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to him. Lady Beatrice, at the table's head, gripped her wineglass tightly. Roland Finch, seated beside a nervous debutante, paused mid-sentence, his smile frozen. Gideon Wells, sipping water, set his glass down with deliberate care. Clara, serving a tray of soup, froze at the edge of the room, her hands trembling visibly. "We have new information," Harrow continued. "A witness, a reliable one, claims to have seen someone near the dressing room at the time of the theft. I won't say who, but rest assured, we're closing in. If the guilty party wishes to come forward, now's the time." The effect was immediate. Lady Beatrice's glass slipped slightly, splashing wine onto the tablecloth, though she recovered with a quick laugh. Finch's eyes darted to Wells, then back to his plate, his fingers tapping a rapid rhythm on the table. Wells's face remained impassive, but Miss Marple noted the slight tightening of his jaw, the way his hand brushed his cufflink. Clara, however, was the most telling. She dropped the ladle into the tureen, the clatter echoing in the silence, and her face went ashen. I'm sorry, sir," she stammered, bending to retrieve it, her movements jerky and panicked. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly in her lap, her eyes missing nothing. The announcement had shaken them all, but Clara's reaction was the most pronounced, her fear almost palpable. Guilt, Miss Marple thought, or the fear of being found out? She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a panicked confession had come after a similar ruse, the thief undone by their own nerves. The lace, the lavender, the bulging pocket, all pointed to Clara, but the trap would reveal whether she acted alone or as part of a larger scheme. Dinner proceeded with strained civility, the guests' chatter a thin veneer over their unease. Miss Marple, seated near the end of the table, observed Clara closely as she moved about, her apron pocket still bulging slightly. The girl avoided eye contact, her steps quick and unsteady, as if she longed to flee. Finch, meanwhile, resumed his charm, but his glances toward Wells were frequent, almost accusing. Wells remained composed, but Miss Marple caught him watching Clara, his eyes narrowing briefly as she passed. After dinner, as the guests retired to the drawing-room, Miss Marple slipped away, her small figure moving unnoticed through the corridors. She had arranged with Harrow to keep an eye on the servants' quarters, suspecting Clara might act under the pressure of the witness. Reaching the narrow staircase to the servants' wing, she paused, her ears straining for any sound. The manor was quiet, save for the distant murmur of voices from the drawing room. She climbed the stairs, her steps silent on the worn runner, and reached the attic floor, where the maids' rooms were tucked under the eaves. Clara's room was at the end of the corridor, its door slightly ajar. Miss Marple hesitated, then pushed it open, her eyes scanning the sparse furnishings, a narrow bed, a wooden chair, a small chest of drawers. On the bed lay a bundle of linens, hastily tied, as if prepared for a quick departure. Miss Marple's lips pursed. A girl planning to leave, she thought, needs a reason and means. She moved to the chest, her fingers brushing the top drawer. Inside, among neatly folded clothes, she found a hollowed-out book, a worn copy of the Bible, its pages cut to form a small compartment. Nestled within was the emerald necklace, its green stones glinting in the dim light of the single bulb overhead. Miss Marple's breath caught, not from surprise, but from the confirmation of her suspicions. The lace, the lavender, Clara's panic, all led here. Before she could touch the necklace, footsteps sounded in the corridor. Miss Marple stepped back, her heart steady despite the suddenness, and Clara appeared in the doorway, her face a mask of terror. "Miss Marple!" she gasped, her hands clutching the door frame. What are you doing here?" "I might ask you the same, my dear," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle but firm. "This is a heavy burden for a young girl to carry." She gestured to the book, her eyes meeting Clara's with a quiet compassion that belied her resolve. Clara's knees buckled, and she sank onto the bed, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I didn't mean to," she sobbed. "I only wanted to help my brother. He's in trouble, bad trouble in Canada." "The necklace. It was there, and I thought I could sell it, get away, start over." Her words came in a rush, broken by sobs, and Miss Marple listened, her expression softening, but her mind alert. "You took it from the case," Miss Marple said, not a question but a statement, "with your key, when you were meant to be in the kitchens." Clara nodded, her hands twisting in her apron. "I went back just for a moment. Her ladyship was downstairs, and I unlocked the case. I didn't think anyone would see, but I got scared, hid it here, and then the inspector started asking questions." Her voice trailed off, and she buried her face in her hands. Miss Marple sat beside her, her touch light on the girl's shoulder. "And the lace in the garden? You were there, weren't you, checking the window?" She kept her tone gentle, coaxing the truth without accusation. Clara nodded again, her voice muffled. "I thought maybe I could make it look like someone climbed in, but I didn't know how, and I got caught on the bush." She looked up, her eyes pleading. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone." "I just wanted to save my brother," Miss Marple nodded, her mind fitting the final pieces together. Clara's confession explained the lace, the lavender, the bulging pocket, likely holding the key or a small tool for the lock. But Wells's telephone call and Finch's debts still lingered, threads that suggested a broader web. "You've been brave to tell me," she said softly, "but we must tell the inspector." "The truth, my dear, is the only way," Clara's sobs quieted, and she nodded, her shoulders slumping in defeat. Miss Marple rose, the book with the necklace in hand, and led the girl downstairs, where Harrow waited. The trap had worked, revealing Clara's guilt, but Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Wells and Finch. Their glances, their whispered words, there was more to uncover, and she would not rest until every thread was pulled. Chapter 12. The Truth Revealed. The drawing-room of Greystone Manor was bathed in the soft glow of evening lamps, their light reflecting off the polished mahogany and casting intricate shadows on the damask walls. The gathered guests, their faces a mix of curiosity and apprehension, sat in a semicircle around Inspector Harrow, who stood before the fireplace, his notebook closed and his expression resolute. The air was heavy with the weight of anticipation, as if the room itself held its breath. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her usual corner chair, her knitting needles still for once, observed the scene with her characteristic quiet alertness. The emerald necklace, now recovered from Clara's room, lay on a velvet cloth on the side table, its green stones gleaming like secrets laid bare. The trap had been sprung, and the truth was about to be unveiled. Harrow cleared his throat, his voice steady but carrying an edge of triumph. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "the matter of the stolen necklace has been resolved, thanks to a certain sharp-eyed observer." His glance flickered toward Miss Marple, a rare acknowledgement of her role. "The thief has been identified, and the necklace recovered." I'll let Miss Marple explain as she pieced it together. All eyes turned to the elderly woman, whose unassuming presence seemed to fill the room, despite her small stature. She rose slowly, her shawl draped neatly over her shoulders, and stepped forward, her voice gentle but clear. "It's a simple matter, really," she said, her eyes crinkling with a smile that belied the keenness of her mind. "People are not so different wherever you go. They act for reasons that seem pressing to them, and those reasons leave traces if you know where to look." She gestured to the necklace, its emeralds catching the lamplight. "The key to this puzzle was Clara, the maid." Her nervousness was evident from the start. Her trembling hands, her averted glances. But it was the small things that told the story. A scrap of lace from her apron, caught on a thorn bush beneath the dressing-room window. The scent of lavender soap, which lingered on the vanity where the necklace was kept, and a bulging pocket, which suggested she carried something she wished to hide. Miss Marple paused, her gaze resting briefly on Clara, who stood at the back of the room, her face pale and her eyes fixed on the floor. "Clara confessed to me this evening," Miss Marple continued, her tone soft but unwavering. "She took the necklace from the locked case, using her duplicate key during a brief moment when Lady Beatrice was downstairs. Her intention was to sell it, to fund an escape to Canada, where her brother, a sailor with debts, awaits her. She hid the necklace in a hollowed-out Bible in her room, hoping to slip away before suspicion fell on her. The lace in the garden came from an attempt to make the theft look like an outside job, though she lacked the skill to carry it off." A murmur ran through the room, and Lady Beatrice's hand flew to her throat, her pearl pendant a stark contrast to the absent emeralds. "Clara," she said, her voice a mix of disbelief and sorrow. "I trusted her. Years of service, and this?" Her eyes glistened, but Miss Marple noted a flicker of relief, as if the truth, painful though it was, freed her from a heavier burden. Inspector Harrow stepped forward, his hand resting on Clara's shoulder. "She'll be taken to the station for questioning," he said. "The evidence is clear, and her confession seals it." Clara did not resist, her shoulders slumping as a constable led her from the room, her footsteps echoing in the silence. Miss Marple, however, was not finished. Her eyes moved to Roland Finch and Gideon Wells, who sat apart, their faces carefully composed, but their postures tense. "There is more to consider," she said, her voice taking on a quiet authority. Mr. Finch's debts made him a natural suspect, and his absence from the ballroom, however brief, placed him near the terrace, where he might have seen something or someone. His quickness to point to Mr. Wells suggested a connection, perhaps a shared scheme gone wrong. Finch's smile was gone, his eyes narrowing. "I told you, Miss Marple, I was only out for a cigarette. I had nothing to do with this." His voice was sharp, but Miss Marple noted the way his hand clenched the arm of his chair, a telltale sign of unease. "And Mr. Wells," she continued, turning to the jeweller, whose fingers had stilled on his cufflinks. "Your expertise made you a candidate for fencing the necklace, and your telephone call about moving the item raised questions. I wondered if a paste replica might be involved, but the necklace we recovered is genuine, as Lady Beatrice confirmed. Still, your whispered talk with Mr. Finch in the drawing-room suggested you knew more than you let on." Wells's face remained impassive, but his voice was tight. "I made inquiries about a potential buyer, yes, but only as a precaution, in case the necklace surfaced on the market. I had no part in its theft." His eyes flicked to Finch, a silent accusation, and Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. "I believe you, Mr. Wells," she said, her tone measured, "but I suspect you and Mr. Finch discussed the necklace's value, perhaps even a plan to profit from its loss, should it be recovered. Greed, you see, can tempt even those not directly guilty." She paused, letting her words settle, then turned to Lady Beatrice. "And you, my dear, were so quick to defend Clara, perhaps because you feared your own financial troubles might cast suspicion on you. The insurance on the necklace was a safety net, wasn't it, against your late husband's debts?" Lady Beatrice flushed, her hands twisting in her lap. "I never thought of claiming it falsely," she said, her voice low. "But yes, the debts are real. I trusted Clara, and I was wrong." Her admission was reluctant, but Miss Marple's gentle nod conveyed understanding, not judgment. "The truth," Miss Marple concluded, "is often simple, but never without its complexities. Clara acted alone, driven by desperation for her brother. Mr. Finch and Mr. Wells, while not thieves, were not above considering how to turn the situation to their advantage. And Lady Beatrice, your loyalty to Clara blinded you to her distress." She sat down, her knitting bag untouched, her eyes scanning the room one last time. Harrow took over, his voice brisk. "The case is closed. The necklace is returned, and Clara will face the consequences. You're free to go, but I'll have statements from everyone before you leave." The guests murmured, some with relief, others with lingering unease, as they began to disperse. Miss Marple remained in her chair, her thoughts lingering on the human frailties that had woven this mystery. Clara's desperation, Finch's greed, Wells's calculation, Beatrice's denial, all were threads in a tapestry she had seen many times before. She thought of St. Mary Mead, where similar motives had driven similar crimes, and smiled faintly. "People," she murmured, "are always the same wherever you go." As she gathered her knitting bag and rose, her mind was already at rest, the puzzle solved, the truth laid bare by the small things that others overlooked.